A fragment older than the New Testament describes exactly where you go. Not in vague spiritual poetry, not in symbolic cosmic language, but in precise, structural, almost architectural detail. 4 separate chambers. 4 completely different conditions. 4 specific categories of person. Each one determined not by how religious you were, but by what remained unresolved the moment your heart stopped. The church removed this account in 364 CE. They called it dangerous. Jerome called it too precise. Augustine said circulating it would cause people to calculate their standing rather than simply fear God. Nobody said it was wrong. The document. Nobody was supposed to find. 17 centuries of silence is a long time. The Book of Enoch was voted out of Christian scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, banned, called dangerous, and buried so effectively that most of the Western world forgot it had ever existed. Jerome excluded it from the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE. Augustine dismissed it in the City of God around 415 CE. For roughly 17 centuries, the strategy worked. Then in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. What followed was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, and among the fragments pulled from those caves were 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch. 11. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than Exodus, more than most books that survived the council votes and made it into the Bible you can buy at any airport bookstore today. 11 copies is not a fringe text. 11 copies is a library standard. Fragment 4, Q206, now stored at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from chapter 22, dated to around 100 BCE. Older than the Gospels. Older than Paul's letters. The complete version exists in Ge'ez manuscripts held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church at the monastery in Aksum, the same church that never accepted Rome's decision and has kept Enoch in its canon for over 1,600 years. Dr. George Nicholsberg called chapter 22 the most structurally detailed description of the afterlife in any Second Temple Jewish text. The tradition Jesus himself grew up inside. And what makes chapter 22 unusual, even within the already unusual Book of Enoch, is the tone. Apocalyptic literature deals in symbols. Chapter 22 reads like a building inspection report. Enoch isn't interpreting a vision. He's describing a place. That is precisely what the Council of Laodicea found unacceptable. The mountain at the edge of the world. Raphael takes Enoch west. Not spiritually west, not symbolically west. The text is directional, specific. The kind of west that implies you started somewhere and traveled. The angel leads him to a mountain in the far west, beyond the edge of the known world, to a place Enoch describes as vast, dark, and divided. The Ge'ez word used for the space behind the mountain is a term Ethiopian monks also use for a cistern, a deep container built to hold something specific, sealed to prevent mixing, maintained until what is stored inside is needed. That word choice is not incidental. A cistern is not a dungeon. It is not a torture chamber. It is infrastructure. A container engineered for a purpose, and the purpose determines the conditions inside. What Enoch finds behind the mountain is not one undifferentiated space of fire and shadow. It is 4 separate hollows, each sealed from the others, each holding a different category of person, each operating under completely different conditions. What is in one cannot reach what is in another. Dr. Margaret Barker, former president of the Society for Old Testament Study, noted in her 2005 analysis that Enoch's geographical markers consistently point to the southwestern edge of the Judean wilderness. She wasn't making a theological argument, she was making a geographical one. The language Enoch uses is compass direction language, terrain language. the same kind a geologist uses when filing a site report. The afterlife Enoch describes is not a moral binary. Good people go up, bad people go down. It is a record-keeping system, a structured accounting based on the precise nature of what was unresolved at the moment of death. To be fair to the council, and I say this as someone who spends a lot of time reading documents from people who removed things, a four-chambered afterlife with specific admission criteria is genuinely harder to manage than a general heaven and a general hell. Augustine understood this explicitly. A structured afterlife, he argued, would lead people to calculate their standing rather than simply fear God. He was not saying Enoch was wrong. He was saying Enoch was inconvenient. There's a difference. The first hollow. Rest that isn't heaven. The first hollow contains the righteous dead. Not the righteous in the sense of the perfect, not the canonized saints, not the people who got everything right. The righteous in the sense of ordinary decent people who lived without great sin and died without catastrophic moral failure. Your grandmother probably, maybe most of the people you've known. The Ge'ez describes their condition as rest under a spring of bright water, not paradise, not reward, not the throne room of God with a choir and everything gold. Rest, brightness, a holding state. And that word, holding, is where the theological disruption lives. The text specifies that the righteous in the first hollow are not yet in their final destination. They are preserved in comfort, but they are waiting for a judgment that has not yet occurred. The end has not come. The final accounting has not been conducted. The righteous dead are not in heaven because, according to Enoch, heaven in the ultimate sense has not been opened to them yet. They are in something that functions more like a comfortable waiting room than a reward. Which, and I say this gently, is not what most Sunday school curricula describe. This detail is the one Western Christianity found most structurally difficult to accommodate. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory involves purification through suffering, the soul being refined before it is fit for heaven. The first hollow involves no suffering whatsoever. There is no refining process. There is simply rest and brightness and waiting. The righteous dead are already righteous. They do not need to be made more righteous. They simply need the proceeding to begin, and the proceeding has not begun. Dr. Lawrence Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, whose work on the broader Aramaic Anak tradition is the most detailed currently available, noted in a 2015 paper that multiple scribal communities preserved this same first hollow framework. This was not one writer's idiosyncratic idea about the afterlife. Multiple communities, multiple scribes, multiple copies all preserving the same basic structure. The righteous dead in a state of comfortable suspension awaiting a judgment that has not yet arrived. Fragment 4. Q204 from Qumran contains material that appears to describe the first hollow's conditions with slightly different emphasis than the Ge'ez version, but the core structure is consistent. Rest, water, light, waiting. What this means, if you follow it through, is that death for the ordinarily righteous person is not the moment everything gets resolved. It is the moment you enter a system that has not yet processed your case. You are filed correctly. Your conditions are comfortable. But the judgment that determines your permanent status has not occurred. You are, in the language of the cistern metaphor, stored, preserved, maintained until needed. The institutional church found this unsatisfying for obvious reasons. Comfort for the dead is good theology. Indefinite suspension is a harder sell. People want resolution. Churches want to offer resolution. Enoch offers accurate record-keeping instead. The second hollow. The sound that never stops. The second hollow is where it gets disturbing. And I mean that in the specific way that a text from 2,000 years ago should not be capable of disturbing a modern reader, and yet somehow manages it. The second hollow contains the spirits of people who died as victims of violence, people killed without justice, people whose murderers walked free, people whose deaths were never officially acknowledged, never entered into any accounting, never answered for. Their condition is not rest. Their condition is not suffering in the active punitive sense. Their condition is sound. The Gaia's word for what the murdered dead produce in the second hollow is not the word for crying. It is not the word for screaming or weeping or wailing. It is the word for the sound of water that cannot stop. A spring, a river, something that flows because the source has not been cut off. The murdered dead in the second hollow are in continuous motion, making continuous sound, and that sound is not the sound of pain. It is the sound of an unresolved claim pressing against whatever contains it. The Mashafa Berhan, a parallel Ethiopian manuscript tradition, uses a legal term here, the same term Ethiopian scribes used for a formal complaint that has been lodged but not yet adjudicated. The case is open. The sound is the open case making itself known. And the text is explicit that the sound does not stop until the death is formally entered into the divine record, until the case is heard, until the death is officially acknowledged. The murdered dead are not waiting for vengeance. They are waiting for acknowledgement. Until then, they cry, continuously, like water from a source that hasn't been sealed. What sends a person to the second hollow is not sin. This is the detail most people miss because they approach Enoch's afterlife through the lens of a reward and punishment framework. The second hollow has nothing to do with moral failure. What sends a person to the second hollow is being sinned against without remedy, being killed without justice, being wronged without anyone being held accountable. The admission criterion for the second hollow is not what you did. It is what was done to you, and what was never answered for. Scholars working on the broader Enochic corpus have identified related material in fragments 4, Q204, and 4, Q208, that appear to describe the second hollow's conditions. Dr. Stuckenbrook noted, these fragments show evidence of multiple scribal traditions working with the same framework. This is not a marginal concept. This is a shared model of what happens to victims of unresolved violence. And it has been sitting in Aramaic in fragments stored in Jerusalem since before the Gospels were written. The cistern parallel the Mashafa Berhan uses is worth sitting with. A cistern is not a prison. The murdered dead in the second hollow are not being punished. They are being held, preserved in a specific state, maintaining a specific sound, filed under a specific case status, until the relevant proceeding occurs. The case is open. The sound is the open case. When the case closes, the sound stops. Enoch records this without editorializing. He doesn't say it's sad. He doesn't say it's just. He describes what he saw the way a first responder writes what they encountered, without interpreting, without commenting, without softening. The third hollow. Paid in full, still alone. The third hollow is the least discussed chamber. Not because it describes the most extreme condition, but because it describes a consequence that requires no ongoing divine action and offers no narrative drama. There is no fire. There is no active punishment. There is no crying out. The third hollow is dim, quiet, and inhabited by people who are, in a precise technical sense, settled. These are sinners. Specifically, sinners who committed wrongs during their lifetime and received their consequences while still alive. People who did harm, suffered punishment for it, and died with the account technically closed. They are in the third hollow not because the debt is still owed, but because the record of the debt still exists. The Gaius describes their condition as dim, not dark, not bright, dim, a state that implies the account is resolved, but the history of it is not erased. Here is the detail that every popular account of Enoch's afterlife skips entirely. The sinners in the third hollow are alone. not together the way the righteous rest together in the first hollow, not crying together the way the murdered dead cry together in the second hollow. Each spirit in the third hollow is described as separate, isolated, individual. The Ge'ez uses a word Ethiopian scribes also use for scattered grain. Individual pieces present in the same space but unconnected, not grouped, not touching. This is not punishment. The text does not describe it as punishment. It describes it as consequence. The debt was paid. The account is settled. But what you did damaged your connections to others, and settling a debt does not restore what the debt damaged. The third hollow holds people whose moral ledgers are closed and whose relational ledgers are empty. They are dim and they are alone, and the text implies that neither condition requires God to actively maintain it. It simply is, the way absence simply is. I have read a lot of ancient descriptions of the afterlife. I have read Dante. I have read the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I have read the Tibetan Bardo Thodol. The third hollow of Enoch. Chapter 22 is the only afterlife description I have ever encountered that manages to be genuinely melancholy without involving any suffering. No fire, no ice, no torment. Just dimness and disconnection, and the quiet specific weight of things you cannot undo. Dr. Vanderkam, in his 2001 commentary on Enoch for Eerdmans, noted that the third hollow's conditions are described using language consistent with legal settlement rather than moral judgment. The account is closed. The case is not pending. What remains is simply the residue of a life that caused damage, held in a dim, isolated state that the text never describes as temporary but also never describes as inflicted. It simply is. The fourth hollow, the one that got Enoch banned. The fourth hollow is the one that made Jerome nervous. It is the one Augustine specifically argued should not be circulated. It is the one the Council of Laodicea's Canon 60 addresses when it prohibits books describing the structure of places of divine punishment. And it is, when you read the Ge'ez text carefully and follow the admission criterion all the way through, the most institutionally threatening passage in the entire Enochic corpus. The fourth hollow is dark. The text specifies active suffering. The Ge'ez uses a word that elsewhere in Enoch describes the sensation of heat without visible flame, discomfort without an identifiable source. And unlike the first three hollows, the fourth hollow is described as permanent. The text uses the same Ge'ez word for the fourth hollow's permanence that it uses elsewhere to describe the permanence of mountains. Not until judgment. Not pending resolution. Ongoing, without an announced end. Now here is the part that explains everything. The fourth hollow does not contain sinners in general. It does not contain murderers. It does not contain adulterers. It does not contain liars or thieves or the generally wicked. The fourth hollow contains one specific category of person. People who sinned, were not punished for it in life, and who allied themselves with other sinners to sustain wickedness in others. The Ge'ez uses a compound phrase that translates as those who helped wickedness continue. Not people who did wrong, people who protected wrongdoing. People whose specific contribution was making it possible for harm to keep going after it would otherwise have stopped. Let that sit for a moment. Not the person who stole. The person who covered for the theft and ensured the theft could continue. Not the person who committed violence. The person who ensured the violent person faced no consequences and could therefore be violent again. The fourth hollow is reserved for people whose functional role in the world was the protection of harm from accountability. Dr. Nickelsburg identified this passage in his 2001 commentary and noted it represented a category of moral responsibility that Second Temple Jewish writers treated as distinct from ordinary sin. It is not about what you did. It is about what you made possible for others to keep doing. The structural enabler, the institutional protector, the person whose presence in a system allowed the system's harm to persist. Jerome read this passage. We know he did because his exclusion of Enoch from the Latin Vulgate was not a passive omission. He wrote about it. Augustine read it and wrote about it too. Neither man said the fourth hollow's criterion was wrong. Both said it was dangerous. And the danger was not theological in the abstract sense. The danger was institutional. A church that read this passage carefully, that followed the criterion all the way through, would have to ask what structures it was protecting, what systems of harm it was insulating from consequences, what its institutional role was in keeping certain kinds of wrongdoing alive. That is not a question any institution enthusiastically invites. Canon 60 of the Council of Laodicea prohibits books that describe the locations of places of divine punishment in ways that make them accessible to human investigation. The theological reason given is that such locations are reserved for God's knowledge alone. But the fourth hollow's problem was not its geography. Its problem was its admission criterion. A hell with 4 chambers and specific, accessible criteria is not manageable the way a general hell is manageable. You cannot offer absolution against the fourth hollow's criterion by confessing the sin. The criterion is not your sin. The criterion is the wickedness you kept alive in others, the harm you protected from its natural consequences, the system you maintained. You cannot confess your way out of a structural role, especially if the structure is still running. What the translators removed. The standard English editions deserve scrutiny here. H. Charles produced the 1906 English translation of Enoch that most people still reference today. His rendering of chapter 22 is competent, scholarly, and missing things. Not by accident. Charles was working primarily from Ge'ez manuscripts and Greek fragments, and he made editorial decisions. Decisions he documented in his footnotes with a candor that later editors did not always maintain. What the Ge'ez manuscripts in Aksum contain, and what Western editions consistently omit, is a set of clauses at the end of chapter 22 that the Ethiopian tradition preserves and the European tradition dropped. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, confirmed that specific clauses in the Aksum Ge'ez text were excluded from most published editions because they introduced what his editorial notes describe as claims inconsistent with eschatological finality, which is academic language for. The text said things that contradicted the church's version of how the afterlife works, and so editors made decisions. The specific clause Dr. Isaac flagged concerns the timing of the 4 hollows. The Western editions present the 4 chambers as static. The dead are there, the conditions are fixed. That is the end of the description. The Ge'ez text adds language suggesting the hollows are maintained actively, that the conditions in each hollow are not simply the absence of something, but the presence of a specific state being held in place until a proceeding that has not yet occurred. The afterlife in the fuller Ge'ez version is not a destination. It is a process in suspension, a system running in a holding pattern, awaiting instructions. Access to the Aksum manuscripts was restricted after 1974 following the Ethiopian Revolution, when the new government classified church archives as national cultural property. Dr. Vanderkam applied for access in 1988. Denied. He applied again in 1997. Denied. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, Vanderkam stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references, but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. The suppression at the Council of Laodicea was institutional. The suppression since 1974 is bureaucratic. The effect is the same. The text sits in Aksum behind stone walls and government classification, and the passages that would most completely describe what Enoch saw behind the mountain at the edge of the world remain unavailable to the scholars who would most like to read them. In 2018, a team from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem applied to the Israel Museum for permission to conduct a detailed comparative analysis of Fragment 4, Q206, alongside 3 related Enoch fragments from Qumran, specifically to map the four-chamber description against other Second Temple texts. The museum approved access to 2 of the 4 requested fragments. The other 2 were listed as undergoing conservation. 2 specific fragments, selected from a collection of thousands, containing the most detailed afterlife content in the entire Enochic corpus, still in conservation. No timeline given. What modern research keeps finding here is where the distance between 2,000 years ago and right now collapses in a way that is difficult to dismiss and equally difficult to explain. Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU Langone Medical Center has spent over 2 decades studying what patients report during cardiac arrest. The period when the heart stops, brain activity becomes unmeasurable, and the clinical definition of death is met. His research, published in the journal Resuscitation in 2014, documents consistent patterns across hundreds of independent accounts from patients who were later resuscitated. The distress experiences Parnia found almost never involve physical pain. They involve something else, a sense of unresolved accounting. Not punishment, not fire, not a figure with a ledger marking your sins. A feeling of being held at a boundary, aware of something unresolved, aware of a case that has not been closed. A state defined not by what is being done to you, but by what remains pending. Enoch describes the restless spirits of the murdered dead crying out for their case to be heard, for their death to be entered into the divine record. 2,300 years later, Parnia's research documents, across hundreds of independent accounts from people who were clinically dead and then weren't, a distressing state defined by awareness of unresolved accounting. Not punishment, pending reckoning, an open case pressing against whatever holds it. 2 sources separated by 2 millennia describing the same functional experience in the same structural terms. In 2022, a separate study in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, also led by Dr. Parnia, found that awareness during clinical death was sometimes accompanied by a simultaneous awareness of the consequences of one's actions on others. Not guilt in the emotional sense. Awareness of consequence, the impact rippling outward from decisions, visible in a way it had not been visible during life. What people describe from the other side of cardiac arrest is not a judgment. It is a clarity about what remained unresolved. This matches the structure of Enoch's 4 hollows more closely than it matches any Western theological framework. Not one undifferentiated destination. Not heaven for the good and fire for the bad. A structured accounting based on the specific nature of what was unresolved at the moment of death. The righteous waiting for a proceeding, the murdered waiting for acknowledgement, the punished sinner sitting in the dim residue of settled accounts, and the enabler of harm in permanent darkness with heat that has no flame. Dr. Lawrence Stuckenbrook has noted in his work on the Qumran Enoch tradition that the 4 hollow framework shows evidence of being a consensus model. Not one author's unusual theology, but a shared framework preserved across multiple communities and multiple scribal traditions. Multiple groups, separated by geography and time, all working with the same basic architecture of the afterlife. Enoch wrote this around 200 BCE. Parnia's research team documented structural parallels in 2014. Neither result was looking for the other. Both found the same shape. A fragment of parchment sits in Jerusalem under glass. The manuscripts in Aksum sit behind stone walls and government restriction. The 2 fragments in Jerusalem are still in conservation with no timeline given. And a text the church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago. A text that made Jerome uncomfortable and Augustine strategically nervous, continues to describe the same afterlife architecture that near-death experience research keeps documenting independently in resuscitation wards in New York. The 4 hollows are still there in the Aramaic and the Ge'ez. The first hollow is still rest that is not yet resolution. The second hollow is still continuous sound pressing against an unanswered accounting. The third hollow is still dim and quiet and specifically alone. And the fourth hollow, the permanent one. The one reserved not for sinners in general, but for the people who kept wickedness alive in others, who insulated harm from its consequences, who maintained systems that protected the wrong people, is still described in a fragment older than the New Testament, in language that Jerome read and Augustine read, and neither one of them called wrong. They called it dangerous. The distinction between wrong and dangerous is not a small one. Wrong can be corrected or dismissed. Dangerous means it might be accurate, and accuracy in this case carries implications that reach into every structure, every institution, every system that has ever protected harm from accountability. The mountain is still at the edge of the world. Raphael is still waiting at the trailhead. And somewhere behind it, in 4 sealed hollows that a man named Enoch documented with the flat precision of a building inspector, the dead are still waiting for a proceeding that has not yet begun, still crying out for a case that has not yet been heard, still sitting in the dim quiet of a settled account or in the permanent heat of a consequence that has no announced end. The manuscripts remain in Axum. The fragments remain in Jerusalem. The 4th hollow remains, in Aramaic older than Christianity, exactly as Enoch described it. Waiting.